Romans chapter 1, verse 16, one of my favorite verses. The scripture says, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then to the Greek or the Gentile. So what we've been saying is that the gospel, good news, the gospel is Jesus. And that Jesus desires to meet every basic need in our life. And so therefore, what we want to talk about today, and this is an interesting one, I think, but that Jesus meets our need for a correct or right concept of God. And you'll see how this unfolds as we go along. So the passage that I want to look at, I'm only going to look at part of the passage this time, and then the next time we'll read the whole thing. But if you want to read ahead, you certainly can do that. This is John chapter 6. After this, verse 1, Jesus crossed the lake of Galilee, and a great crowd followed him, because they had seen the signs which he gave in his dealings with the sick. But Jesus went up to the hillside and sat down there with his disciples. The Passover, the Jewish festival, was near. So Jesus raised his eyes, seeing a great crowd on their way towards him, said to Philip, "Where can we buy food for these people to eat?" He said this to test Philip, for he himself knew what he was going to do. 20 pounds worth of bread would not be enough for them, Philip replied, even if they had only a little each. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, another disciple, put in, "Well, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish, but what's the good of that for such a crowd?" So I'm going to stop there, and if you want to read ahead, that's fine. But let me just make some comments on what I've read so far. So the crowds are following Jesus, and Jesus has had a amazingly crowded schedule and busy time. They're trying to move away, maybe to get a little break, a little rest, but there's no vacation. Literally, we need to understand sometime in our own lives that we can get peopled out. It doesn't mean we don't like people, we don't care for people, we don't want to help people, but we can get peopled out. I think you probably understand what I'm talking about. And so it says in Mark 6:34, when he saw the crowd, and this is kind of a companion to the verses we're reading in John 6, it said, he had compassion on them. And that little word compassion means this: he felt each one of their needs. Now think about that. That Jesus Christ, the Son of God, God in a body, understands and feels, empathizes, knows every one of your needs. Every one of your needs. And then he gives a test. He looks at Philip. In verse number 5, this is what it says. Again, I'll repeat this. It says, he says to Philip, "Where can we buy food for all these people?" And he said this to test him. And then Philip comes back with a number. 20 pounds worth of bread would not be enough to feed all these people. And so here's Philip, the bean counter. Someone said he had a slide rule for a brain. Well, he gives a calculation. Then he goes and he talks to, or asks a question of Andrew, and Andrew says, said, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish, but what good is that for such a crowd as this?" So what he was saying was this: no way a problem can be solved with 5 barley loaves and a couple of fish. Wow. So that's another view in terms of how he was looking at this. But let me give you a thought. This is a good thought. Common sense sometimes can be close to stupidity. Let me repeat that. Common sense sometimes can be close to stupidity. The disciples grossly underestimated their wealth in Jesus Christ. And so Thomas Carlyle said this: "Men are like the gods they serve." Another way to say that is, we conduct our lives according to the concept of God to whom we bow. For years I've said it this way: your concept of God would determine your commitment to God. So think about this. The disciples had seen Jesus change water to wine. The disciples had seen Jesus heal the official's son at probably about a 20-mile distance. They are also seen Jesus heal in John chapter 5 the paralytic by the pool. Do you remember David and Goliath, 1 Samuel chapter 17? So here's little David standing up to the 10-foot giant. I'm not going to go over that whole story, but you might want to read that sometime. I want to read just a couple verses there. Maybe we need to have the David kind of concept of God instead of the limited concept that the disciples had at this point. Listen to this, 1 Samuel chapter number 17, beginning with verse number 45. David said to the Philistine, this is Goliath, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. So here's my question for the little lesson today. What is your concept of God? What's your concept of God? And what kind of God do you serve? Well, you might ought to think about that.